All right, diving in again. This time we're grabbing our thinking caps, getting ready to explore, well, Reddit.
Reddit.
Yeah, Reddit, specifically the For Philosophy subreddit. You've given us this really interesting peek into what people are talking about over there, and honestly, I gotta say, I'm pretty curious to see where this goes.
Yeah, it's like a mini universe of philosophical thought, isn't it? Just
Yeah.
anyone, no matter who they are or what they know, can jump in and wrestle with these huge questions.
Yeah, and it's not all like, stuffy academics and jargon either. We're talking people debating, like everything, from what is reality even to, like, is it actually better if three people get their way instead of just one?
Yeah, that's the classic, the age-old tension right there. What do we
Yeah.
want as individuals versus what's good for everyone,
Yeah.
right? That actually, you know what that thread makes me think of? That whole debate ties into this classic philosophical problem called the Gettier Problem.
Okay, now Gettier Problem. That that sounds a lot more like, I don't know, a leaky faucet than some big philosophical idea. Break it down for me. What's the core of it?
Okay, imagine this. You're walking through a field, right? And you find a watch just lying there on the ground. You pick it up, check the time, and it's accurate. So naturally, you think, hey, this watch works. But what if later you find out this watch is actually broken? It just happened to be stuck at the right time, purely by chance.
Oh, I see. I think I see what you're getting at. So, like, my belief that the watch works, it is true. The watch did tell the right time. But my reasoning for it, my justification, is totally off.
Exactly, you hit the nail on the head. The Gettier problem throws a wrench in our traditional definition of knowledge.
Right.
It asks, can we really call something knowledge if the reasons we believe it are, well, flawed? Even if, by some cosmic coincidence, our conclusion ends up being right.
That'll really make you stop and think. It makes you wonder how much of what we think we know is actually based on, like, solid reasoning and how much is just, well, lucky guesses. Yeah.
Exactly. And think about how this plays out in our daily lives, right? Take eyewitness testimony, for example. It's often seen as pretty strong evidence, right? But what if, like our broken watch, there are things going on beneath the surface, things that could throw that testimony into question? The Gettier problem, it encourages us to look beyond the surface, to really examine the why behind what we believe.
That's a really good point. Like, we can't just take everything at face value, right? We've got to dig a little deeper, which, now that I think about it, that's a pretty good summary of what we're doing in this deep dive too, right?
And speaking of digging deeper,
Yeah.
we can't gloss over that thread about Stephen Hawking and his really intriguing take on the nature of reality.
Oh, right. The whole, like, arguing against the idea of a single objective reality. And coming from a renowned physicist like Hawking, that's a bold statement. It kind of makes your head spin a little, doesn't it?
It definitely challenges our assumptions, that's for sure. What Hawking proposed was that there could be, multiple scientific models that all accurately explain the same things we observe. Each model could be perfectly valid within its own framework, but each one might present a totally different picture of what reality is.
So are we saying that there isn't one single capital T truth out there? Does that mean science is more about finding the most, I don't know, the most useful model rather than uncovering some kind of absolute objective reality?
Well, that's a question that's been puzzling philosophers and scientists for centuries. Hawking's idea, though, it opens up some really interesting possibilities. Imagine, for instance, two different scientific models that both perfectly explain how the universe began. They both match what we observe, they both make accurate predictions, but they tell completely different stories about the origin of everything.
That's kind of wild when you think about it. So, like, if we're living in a world where there could be multiple truths, how do we even begin to make sense of it all? Does that mean, like, does that undermine the whole point of science? Or is it maybe pointing us towards a bigger, more, I don't know, a more open-minded view of knowledge?
I think it definitely encourages us to widen our perspectives, right? Maybe instead of clinging to this idea of one single absolute truth, it's more helpful to think of these scientific models as different lenses. Each one gives us a different way of looking at and understanding the universe. And each lens, it offers a valid perspective. It adds to our overall understanding without claiming to have all the answers. You know what I mean?
It's like that old story about the blind man and the elephant, right? They're each touching a different part, and each one thinks they have the whole picture figured out.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. That story really gets across how limited our individual perspectives can be, even when we're talking about something like science. It's a humbling thought, for sure, but But in a way, it can also be kind of freeing, don't you think?
It really does make you wonder if this applies to other areas of life too, right? Like maybe even our own personal beliefs, how we see the world, maybe those could benefit from a little bit of that multiple models thinking.
Absolutely. Being open to different perspectives, it's crucial, and not just in science, but in how we deal with all the complicated stuff that comes with being human, you know? And speaking of which, you remember that story about little Ian? That one really highlights this whole idea.
Oh yeah, the one where he's like questioning why it's automatically better if three people get to choose what to watch on TV instead of just one person getting their way.
That's the one. His question, I mean, it seems so simple when you first hear it, but it really throws a wrench into our assumptions about majority rule. You know, it
Yeah.
makes us think about the ethics of it all. Like, is it always right to prioritize what the majority wants, even if it means overlooking the needs of the individual?
It's really something when you think about it, how a kid's like straight up observation can expose these flaws in how we adults think.
It really is. And, you know, his question, it touches on this fundamental debate in ethics.
Hmm.
How do we even decide what's right and wrong? Do we base it on what will create the most happiness for the most people? Or do we give everyone's desires and needs equal weight? There's no easy answer there. And that's exactly what makes it such a thought-provoking philosophical question, you know?
It seems like every thread we pull on in this subreddit just leads to even more questions. But that's part of the fun of it, right? It's about being okay with the uncertainty, being okay with not having all the answers, and just enjoying this process of questioning and exploring.
You got it. And sometimes, you know, that exploration, it means looking inward, which brings us to that thread about, well, about the potential downsides of introspection.
Right. The whole idea that just constantly analyzing our every thought and feeling, maybe that's not always the best way to figure ourselves out, even though a lot of us think it is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Introspection, it can be useful, it can be a good thing, but it can also backfire on you, you know? The more we obsess over every little flaw, every insecurity we have, the bigger those things can seem. It's like staring into one of those distorted mirrors at a carnival, you know?
Hmm.
Your reflection just gets more and more warped.
It's like when you overthink something so much that you end up feeling more confused and anxious than when you started.
Exactly. Sometimes trying to understand ourselves by like endlessly digging around in our own heads, it can actually make us feel even more lost and uncertain about who we are.
So if overdoing introspection isn't the answer, what is? How do we gain a better understanding of ourselves without getting, trapped in our own thoughts?
Well, some philosophers, they'd say that action, more than introspection, is the key to self-discovery. It's by engaging with the world, building connections with others, facing challenges head on. That's how we truly reveal ourselves,
Yeah.
you know? And that's something that introspection alone, it just can't replicate.
It's like that saying, we are what we repeatedly do, right? It's not just what we think about, but what we actually do that shapes who we are.
Yeah.
It's like we're always writing our own stories, right? But it's not just with our thoughts, it's with what we actually do. And maybe if we pay attention to the story we're creating with our actions, that can help us understand ourselves in a way that just thinking about it never could.
That's a really powerful way to put it. And it makes me think of another one of those threads we wanted to get into today.
Yeah.
This one's about the power of language itself.
Hmm.
Because, I mean, if what we do comes from what we think, then what shapes our thoughts in the first place?
Right.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you really think about it, this idea that something as basic as language could be influencing how we see the world, how we understand everything around us.
It really makes you question everything, doesn't it? This thread, it goes deep on this idea that language, it doesn't just describe reality, it actually shapes it. The words we use, the grammar, the whole system, it creates this framework, and we're stuck experiencing and understanding the world through that framework.
It's almost like we're living in the Matrix, right? But instead of being trapped by code, it's language that's dictating our reality.
Maybe not quite as dramatic as the Matrix, but yeah, you're getting at the heart of it. The analogy really gets across how limiting language can be. You know,
Right.
we need it. It's essential for communication, for thinking, for everything, really. But at the same time, that framework, it might also be preventing us from really grasping the full picture of reality, a reality that might exist beyond what we can put into words.
It's like trying to describe a color to someone who's never seen it before. You just don't have the words to do it justice.
Exactly. Or imagine trying to explain like a really complex emotion, but you only have a limited vocabulary to work with. You might lose the essence of that emotion in translation. It's limited by the very tool we're trying to use to express it.
Wow, we have gone down some rabbit holes in this deep dive. We started with a broken watch in a field, and now here we are, questioning the nature of reality, the limits of introspection, and the power of language to shape how we see the world.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it, how each one of these threads, even though they seem totally different at first, they all kind of weave together into this larger tapestry of philosophical thought. And it all goes back to what makes that var philosophy subreddit so interesting in the first place. It's a space where these big, fundamental questions are being asked and debated, pushing us to think beyond our usual assumptions.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And, as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the biggest takeaway is this. Philosophy, it's not just some abstract academic thing. It's relevant to our lives, to everyone's lives. It shapes how we see ourselves, our relationships, our place in the universe, everything.
Absolutely. It's about being curious, about asking questions, being open to different ways of looking at things,
Yeah.
and just being open to learning and growing throughout our lives.
Perfectly put. So as you go about your day, keep those philosophical minds of yours engaged, all right? Question everything, be open to different perspectives, and never underestimate the power of a good thought experiment, whether it's about a broken watch or the nature of reality itself.
And hey, who knows? Maybe you'll stumble across some fascinating philosophical discussions happening right in your own backyard.
Now, that's a great point. After all, philosophy, it's everywhere if you know where to look. Until next time, everyone, keep those minds curious.